Welcome back to Tanya in 5. The last few days, we have been studying Chapter 7 of Book 3 of Tanya, Iggeret HaTeshuva. In Chapter 1, the Alter Rebbe defined the essence of the mitzvah of Teshuvah. Namely, it is a decision a person makes to abandon all sin and return to the service of God. In Chapter 4, the Alter Rebbe opened with a question. What is the proper method of arriving at this decision? What should be the thought process that leads me to conclude that I must abandon sin and return to serving God? In Chapter 7 now, after having spent the last 3 chapters explaining the Kabbalah of sin, the Alter Rebbe returns to answering this question. What should be the proper motivation to arrive at the decision to no longer sin? So what did we learn about the Kabbalah and the mystical dimension of sin? We learned essentially 2 things. Number 1, sin causes an obstruction between man and God. God projects his very internal energy into man, and that becomes his soul, this essential, inherent divine energy, connected to him himself, to God himself. And when one sins, one causes an obstruction in that connection. That's the first thing we learned. The second thing we learned is that in our time, in the post-temple era, in the time of exile, when we sin, we drag the godly soul, and we drag the godly soul's source, the divine energy itself, into a place of negativity and into a place of sin. Now, if that's the case, when one does Teshuvah, when one returns to the service of God, one is restoring order to the flow of divine energy. When a person returns to the path of God, then the divine energy invested in him reconnects back in a proper fashion to the divine source. So the translation of Teshuvah, in the mystical sense, is not just to return to God, but to restore the divine system. Specifically, the last letter of God's name, the letter He, which is divine capacity to project, which projects energy into the soul of man. This is now restored, so that the flow of energy is in a proper fashion in accord with divine desire. Now, with all of this in mind, now we know what the proper way to be motivated to do Teshuvah. A person has to do 2 things, or think 2 things. Number 1, a person should consider and awaken within him a compassion on his soul. Poor thing. It's been dragged in such a lowly place. And not just it itself was dragged into this lowly place, but it dragged with it God. Divine energies have been invested in this soul, and it's been dragged into this lowly place of sin. What an embarrassment. What pity. That's number 1, to feel compassion for the soul. Number 2, I have to turn to myself and say, how low can you get? How did you come to the point where you're willing to take your godly soul and drag it into such a lowly place? You're willing to choose to detach yourself from God? How could you have fallen to such a place? Such a lowly space to make such a choice? Now, a person might say, well, I haven't done such grievous sins that will totally detach me from God. They're just kind of small sins. When a person thinks of sins as small, what they end up doing is they end up treating it like it's nothing and doing that sin many times. And just like if you were to take 100 or 1,000 thin layers and pile them up over the window, your room would become dark, just as if you were to put a thick barrier in that window. Likewise, it is with small sins. When you do enough of them, they too cause an obstruction. And aside from that, there are certain sins that in the classic sense aren't as grave as the major sins, but in terms of detachment from God, they are that bad. Like anger, arrogance, speaking gossip, a number of other such sins which display a certain careless detachment from God. And therefore everybody can turn to themselves and say, how could you have done that? How could you have stooped so low to choose to detach from God? Now, with these 2 things in mind, a person makes a decision, that's it. I'm returning to the service of God. I'm going to restore my godly soul's connection to God himself and restore the flow of divine energy. That is a real motivation to Teshuvah. The takeaway from all of this is, in addition to the obvious, I want to point out that it is interesting to note that here Teshuvah and sin is not merely a personal choice. Am I going to be a good boy or not going to be a good boy? But rather, the entire divine order rests upon my behavior. When I sin, I mess with the divine system of flowing his energy into this world. And when I return to him and I do Teshuvah, I restore order to the divine system. It's kind of like when someone's driving in a car and he knows his family's with him, he drives more carefully, knowing that he's not just taking his own personal life into his hands, but he's taking to the life of his family as well. Likewise, we have to understand that sin and Teshuvah is not just a personal question, but it's actually a question of the divine system itself that must be restored, or, God forbid, can be broken. Looking forward to seeing you when we conclude Chapter 8.